Good evening, everybody. My name is Doneley Meris. I'm the Executive Director of HIV Arts Network. This is the fourth of a series of panel discussions that we've been having since the opening of David Wojnarowicz and Louise Frangella's show here at Bromm Gallery. Tonight we are honored to have Dan Cameron and Stephen Lack. Dan is, we're lucky to have him back here in New York because he was the chief curator at the Orange County Museum of Art for a few years. Before that, before he moved to California, he was the senior curator at the New Museum, where he highlighted the work of David Wojnarowicz in 1999. And I'm sure he'll be doing a lot more curating over the course of many years, and we're glad you're back to New York City.
Thank you.
And Stephen is an artist, painter, and film actor. He had featured roles in the movie Scanner and
the other ones you're not allowed to talk about.
Dead Ringers.
Dead Ringers, Dead Harangers.
And he has multiple art in residencies, and he was twice a recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts grant. And he's also famous for another thing, which is that he's the father of Asher Lack, who is the front person for Ravens and Chimes. A band, international
Have you been listening?
I just did.
Yeah.
So, welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to start this conversation by taking you back to your memory lanes with your both personal and professional relationships with David Wojnarowicz and Louise Frangella. How you met them, and what was your interactions with them during the times that they were still with us?
You want to lead, or?
Why don't you dive in?
Okay. Well, first of all, David was very tall, so you always wondered who he was right away. And if you ever heard him speak, you again had that underlined. Who is this guy? He was putting something up on the ceiling at Gracie's famous show.
Gracie Mansion.
Gracie Mansion.
Mm-hmm.
She had this show, the famous show. And I loved his work. I didn't know all of it, I wasn't outdoors that much. I'm a farm animal. And he was up there on the ladder, and I said, oh yeah, that's beautiful. I forget what it was, but whatever it was fantastic. And he looked down and he said, "Oh, who are you?" And I said, "I'm Stephen Lack." He goes, "Oh, you did Burning Limo in Beirut. I like that painting a lot." And I went like, "Oh, and I love you. I love you, but I loved you first." So that's how we met. And Louis, well, we're here to talk about Louis and David. They both had a quality that a lot of the other artists didn't have. And that is they weren't trying to make you feel bad. As people think, oh, you're going into the arts, it's so wonderful. Everybody is like, oh, I would love to be an artist. Really? That's like saying I'd like to be a piranha fighting over a dead pig in the Amazon, I mean, come on. So, what?
Next is that.
No, the piranhas are in good shape, exactly. So at least they have a pig to fight over. So, yeah. So Louis was one of those unbelievably comforting, friendly, wise people. As you go to, and you're always in a state of agitation. You bump into an artist and they go like, "Oh yeah, I saw your work in such and such a place. Great." And you're thinking, "Oh my God, talk about a poison pill. I know I'm not going to make it across the street before this little compliment is going to kill me." So David and Louis were both different that way. They were comforting, and they were intelligent. Somebody said about Elvis, one of the great things about Elvis was, as good as he was, you always felt he had more to give. And you feel the same way with David, and you felt the same way with Louis. And I got to say, I was a family person. And I know that AIDS is part of the pivoting on this.
Yep.
And I have crossed the border. I have got a passport. I can go freely wherever. And but I was a family person, still am, in the East Village, and so I didn't go out much. I had already done my partying, and I was older than everybody else. I'm like 10, 12 years older than David, and never knew how old Louis was. And
He was 58 when he died.
Was that?
He was 58 when he died.
Oh yeah, so he was closer to my age, maybe even older. If he was 58 when he died.
He was born in 46.
I was
46.
I was about 58 when I died too.
46.
I die a little bit every day, but that's because I'm sensitive. And so, anyhow, yeah, Louis, just a good heart. And I went and I visited him at his studio, which was near mine. He was on Forsyth Street, right? And the big Mickey Mouse heads, and the cardboard, and the mystery of it. And I'm looking at it, and I'm wondering, just how does this all work? I mean, yeah, I've seen Klaus Oldenburg do Mickey in expressionistic ways and in sculptural ways, but this is so different. And this has a lot of, like, love of the past in it. There's a real reverence in the brushstrokes and a search. You got the feeling that Louis was searching a lot in his brushstroke. There was a real exploration there. David also was exploring, but David was experimenting like a scientist, whereas Louis was like exploring like somebody in a sandbox, you know, building different thises and that's, you know. I don't know. These are fine things, and they could be applied and transferred to each one of them. So, but one thing they had in common, which I'll reiterate, is they both had great hearts. They were both like really good, kind people, as long as you didn't piss them off. But I can't imagine Louis being pissed off.
Right.
And
Not him. David maybe.
Oh, David could be pissed
Right.
off. Yeah.
Right. How about you, Dan? Well, how did you meet these two artists?
Well, this is interesting because not being an artist, I had a very different relationship to that world. I was someone who was around. I was writing about the East Village. I was curating about the East Village, but I was emphatically not an artist. At least I was not putting myself in that role in the world. And the relationship that David had to me and the relationship that Louis had to me were dramatically different in that sense. I fell in love with David's work instantly. As soon as I saw it, actually my first exposure to it was the 1982 biennial, as best I can remember, but I was really blown away by the work in that show. 83, I think, maybe was the correct show. And so I kind of tried to track him down, and he really didn't want anything to do with me. And the more I would write about him, the clearer he was in making it known to me that it was probably better for the two of us if we kept our distance. And so it wasn't hostility on his part, but it was really clear in
Protecting
his mind
himself.
that there was a world that he inhabited, and there were people who he considered his peers, who he spoke to. And somebody like Carlo, who would be sort of more on the scene, had actually a similar experience in a way. David did not warm to the critics and the curators. That wasn't really his thing. He was interested in other artists, other artistic spirits, and that's really, it seems, who he was the closest with.
In spite of the fact that he was a writer himself, and you're a writer, that connection or that art form did not entice him in some way.
Being a writer in the way that David was a writer, and being a writer in the way that I was writing about writing my art criticism are really two very different things.
Very.
I was attempting to report on and develop opinions about what was going on around me. I wasn't creating prose and poetry that I wanted to sort of have burn their way into people's consciousness. I mean, it was clear that David wrote in a way that I just was in awe of. And I guess it was also his kind of Renaissance man aspect. The fact that I was doing music at the time, coincidentally, but David was barely even, it appeared to me, trying to do music, and yet his music was better than almost anyone else's on the scene. And then you add his poetry, and you add his photography, and you add the painting and the sculpture. It was sort of overwhelming how incredibly gifted he was in everything that he did.
Right.
So compared to Louis, that was a very different relationship. I had a very easy professional relationship with him. I wrote about him in different occasions. And we had a particular connection through Spain. Because he was very active with a gallery in Madrid called Galleria Boades, and I knew them fairly well. And so we had this very interesting relationship where Luis knew that I was interested in Hispanic culture, he knew I was interested in Argentina. I wanted to know a lot from him about where he came from and what his formation was, and how that figured in the way he made his art. Right. So we had this sort of kind of classic critic, curator, artist thing where I would visit him in his studio and we would talk about the work that he was doing. And it's funny when I say it this way, it isn't as if I had a relationship with Louis that I wished I'd had with David, but it was just obvious to me that whatever I thought might happen in terms of a friendship with David was fated not to happen, but that my relationship to his work, which, again, I was trying not to invest too much in personal relationships with artists at the time. I just felt like, well, maybe there should be a little bit of a zone beyond which you don't really go, because who knows how messy it could get.
Oh, because
and it does, and it has.
Yeah.
And so, maybe David had the right idea at the time. I don't know, but with Louis, I had a much more easygoing, fluid relationship, and also as a gay man. I felt like Louis was very interested in talking about that, and interested in talking about AIDS. And again, that was part of the whole conversation about art and culture and life and the world. And so that seemed very full to me.
Right. In 1984, Louis invited David to go to Argentina. They spent a few months there. Some of the artworks that they did together are in this space right now. My question is, there's a lot of buzz about particularly David right now for these two artists. David had this retrospective show at the Whitney. He had a show at PPOW Gallery. He had the exhibit at the NYU Fells Library exhibition. And Luis has had a show in Buenos Aires, and now this show here, which will end in on December 31st. What are your thoughts about all of this visibility right now of these two artists, particularly David? I mean, he had several venues that his art was shown, not only his art but also his films.
Well, if we judge by, from the time of the new museum show that I did in '99, where I think there was another show, or maybe another one accompanying, I should just say that in another 15 years, there will be 5 shows or 6 shows devoted to David's work. I mean, he really is one of the essential American artists of the end of the 20th century. I mean, he's essential. And so, as each generation kind of steps into their own, encounter with his work, because each generation encounters his work fresh, and it's for them. They use it, they take it for their own purposes. I think you'll see this spreading of who he was. Also, I think this polymathic aspect of his work is very much a template for how artists work today. So that, I noticed this at the Whitney as well, that the idea that, you hear his voice reading his poetry, and then you look at his photographs, and then you watch the videos, and then you walk around the installations, and it's this very sort of all-encompassing, every possible language represented sort of sensibility that I think is part of the time that we're living in. So I think a lot of artists aspire to being the kind of Renaissance figure. I hate to keep using that phrase, but that kind of figure that David has turned out to be.
Well, it's interesting because not only is the context through art a Renaissance context, but as a contemporary art context, you'd almost say film. Because film has a composition per frame, it has sound, it has dialogue, it has music, and it keeps moving. So there's a lot of the aspects of film that today's artists might be manifesting, film and television, and we're going to see more of that as they. I mean, you take something like Murakami. I mean, if that isn't Saturday morning cartoons, what is? And at the same time, the architecture in New York now reflects Saturday morning cartoons in a lot of ways. It's interesting, also, our relationship to the direction of the culture. And David's insistence on the independent human and his screen against that. And when you see the towers that are being built today in New York, there's no access that we have to penetrate those towers. There are no steps or plazas before those towers that you can imagine people actually hanging out in or anything like that. So the individual is being so compartmentalized. And in David's work, there's such a rage against being defined or being pigeonholed. And also, I mean, I'd have to say, Louis shares that in his own incredibly classical file way when he did those pieces on the pier. Mm-hmm. And those giant 22-foot armless torsos, legless torsos of men, the hips, the muscles, the pectorals, and all of that, 22 feet high. That was an amazing reaction to the reduction we're feeling as individuals today. I feel. You walk down a canyon in New York and you're being compressed. You go into an elevator, you are compressed and you're being washed electromagnetically as you go up 40 floors. I mean, if you can have a thought after that, you're a lucky person. I feel like someone's putting a magnet over my tape and erasing half of me. But I think that David was incredibly analog, and Louis was beyond analog. I mean, those torsos that he painted in that place. Now, Gracie gave Louis a show just before he went, or I guess it was just before he died. I don't know. Yes, it must have been, because it was to kind of support Louis. And they were drawings on 8x10 paper. Is that one of them? Hal's pointing to something in the back. And I got 3 of them from that show. And what was amazing was Louis was drawing in bed. And that's one of the things that, with all the media that we're referring to, the Renaissance man and, using film and using that, but it does also boil down to drawing. Mm-hmm. It is through drawing that we go forward and we make our mark. And Louis's final marks were so sensitive. And when you put them along the continuum, the linear continuum of these 22-foot high torsos, and they were these feeble or frail, I wouldn't say feeble, but frail marks of the last days of Louis Frangella. I mean, they were beautiful, beautiful things. It was like, who was it? Johnny Cash, who did those last sessions in an analog studio with Ruben, and it was just the voice and the thing. It's a beautiful thing, those last drawings of Louis.
Well, when I said that I think that David's influence is spreading and getting greater over time, I think that what's happening in the case of Louis is that there was insufficient attention to his work at the time. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that it's a slow process of catching mm-hmm. up. Mm-hmm. And I think that the theme, and this is kind of to jump to the overall theme tonight, really has to do with where they were in their lives and their careers right. at the moment that AIDS manifested itself. Because you can make a case that prior to prior to getting HIV, prior to their infections, they were both dealing with mortality. They were both very concerned with the perishability of human flesh, and that we all sort of end, that we come to an end. And they both touched on that. They both made art that addressed that very theme. So the idea, you kind of want to think, oh, well, they just made art about AIDS, or they made art that came out of that moment in their life when AIDS happened. And you have to say, no. They were artists, and they already had this trajectory. They are the generation where they were already mature as artists, and then it's just like a locomotive hit them, coming sideways, where they were just, everything was completely turned upside down. Everything that seemed to be sure was falling apart, and everything that seemed stable was crumbling. And
I think the entire East Village reflected that.
It happened to the whole generation. But now looking back at these two artists, one of the things that I've noticed a lot, that I think about a lot about David's work, is that he actually tried to tell us how to die. He tried through his work to sort of say, it's not that often that artists actually address this straight up, because most artists are dealing with other things, other subjects. But his subject turned out to be the process of himself dying. Deconstructing. And so he tracked that, and he captured all the different shifting, vicissitudes of that experience for himself, and shared with us what that was like, how that felt, and all those feelings. And that to me is still mind-boggling, because so few artists have ever attempted to do that in such an explicit sort of way. And of course, in David's case, it was political as well. He was raging against something that was clearly disinterested in whether he died or not.
I think of a series of paintings that Paul Klee did before he died, where his little bright marks descended into darkness and were peering out of the darkness as he approached that other side.
Of course, but Klee was always an artist who tried to make a spiritual journey out of the making of the artwork. Right. I don't see the spirituality as being at the center of either David's or Luis's concerns. I think
he might have tried, but the rage drew a line around it. He did the flower pieces, but again, they were monolithic rather than transportational, or I can't think of a word for it.
You say rage, Stephen. I think of David more as a truth teller. Okay. But the truth that he tells is scalding.
Right.
It's like having boiling
water.
The
prophets were like that.
Yes, there was rage, but it was really the accuracy with which he used language, and which he nailed those perceptions. And
that blood-filled egg, we will never get over that.
Absolutely. It's unbelievable, even today, how it will give us goosebumps.
In the 1980s, there were a lot of collaboration between artists. Do you see that today, given our split-second mentality and generation? You're closer to more artists than I am, so do you see any artists collaborating with each other, creating art together, putting it out there together as opposed to just a single artist? This is my work, look at it.
Well, sure. I mean, there are collaborative groups and teams, like couples or trios who have an identity and they work together. And I see a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration along the lines of what happens at BAM's Next Wave Festival. We have a filmmaker doing the scenography and a choreographer who's working with sculpture, and everyone's kind of participating in these sort of a performative, visual kind of give and take that seems to be more prevalent today than the sort of things that were happening in the East Village, which is really more like Mickey and Judy saying, let's put on a show.
You're right.
Let's just take whatever scraps.
You do the scenery, I'll do the dancing,
I know you're a painter, but you're going to play guitar tonight. Yeah, that idea that, it doesn't matter what you think your skill is, you can do whatever you need to do based on your own improvisational, capacity. I think we have lost a little bit of that. Because the sort of professional sort of over-definition of the artist has become a sort of trap, sort of an encasement.
I mean, what is
it's
the
very hard to get out of.
Bruce High something Foundation?
The Bruce High Quality Foundation?
Yeah, that's a cooperative.
Is that still functioning?
I have no idea.
I think they are defunct as of a few years ago.
I mean, I miss the old days of General Idea. That
Sure.
was,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, I don't know who would be collaborating other than a
Los
bunch of
Carpinteros.
Russians with the president, but
Los
other than
Carpinteros
that.
just split up this year. They are finally
The what?
Los Carpinteros.
I
Los
don't know them.
Carpinteros.
Yeah, they were a Cuban origin collective that started in Havana 24 years ago, and this year they finally disbanded.
24 years, that's a good
24.
run.
That's a pretty good run.
So,
But these easy collaborations. Poets still ask
Right.
artists to do things.
Yes.
And there's certain kind of collaborations that never go away.
And thinking about David and Lewis again, there was a gap between them age-wise. Do you see that happening today, where an older artist mentors a younger artist?
I see a lot of it because I work with artists in a way that brings out their history. So eventually those connections come up. I was with an artist in an artist studio today, for example, and this artist is in his 40s, but it turned out that he's been working since he was a teenager for Red Grooms.
oh,
And you just think, okay, that just grounds everything, because you know what kind of a person Red Grooms is, and the sort of vibe he has, and the kind of world he creates, and
right.
and so I think, but it almost happens in the way that a lot of artists become artist assistants before they become full-blown artists themselves. Like Ashley Bickerton was Jack Goldstein's studio assistant, and painted these corners of Jack, Goldstein's,
Right.
but then
Alexis Rockman
right,
was
but then Rick
Rock
Terranio
Blackman's.
was Ashley Bickerton's studio assistant. So each generation sort of begets its own.
Yeah.
Right.
If you're lucky, and if you're teaching also, that's
if
another
you're
source.
teaching. Yes.
I'd love to mentor some creatures, but the systems won't let me.
Well, Thomas Lanigan Schmidt, who's sort of a parallel character in a certain way. Tommy was in the Stonewall uprising, and so he has a very sort of important part of gay history in New York. He's been teaching at SVA since 1980.
Wow.
And his opening at Howell in the East Village last week was just filled with his former students. Generations of former students who
Well,
just
we'd
showed
love
up
that.
and were like,
That's
you were my
great.
teacher 15 years ago. And,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
it's a really nice thing to see happen, where an artist who's committed that much to sharing with the younger generation.
Right. Are
It's
there
amazing.
any artists in the 1980s, contemporaries like you, of David and Louise, that are still exhibiting today, who are still making AIDS-related art?
That's an interesting question.
I think, I'm talking about, I can only talk about myself, and I think that I address in a lot of the work that I do the repercussions of a plague situation frequently. I also deal with fire. I also deal with flood and water. Whatever the fuck scares me, I'll deal with. And the separation of people, the isolation of individuals, even though they're in the same room or looking at each other, I'll try and impart that into some characterization that I steal from the newspapers or what have you. Gangsters, I love a good gangster, but AIDS specifically, I mean, you know what? My memory is so bad. I'd have to actually look at whatever paintings I've done in the last 2 years, and I think I might have an image or two of somebody eroding, although the symptoms of AIDS have been ameliorated by the present medications.
Absolutely.
So as a result, you don't see the manifestation. But it used to be heartbreaking. I remember in the East Village, not the East Village, in the West Village, and going to some decent Saturday morning breakfast place where the orange juice was really fresh, and being with the kids, and seeing a gay man limping in his pajamas being held up by his parents.
Mm.
And that was heartbreaking. And I think AIDS as an issue, of course, should never be forgotten. I think that there are unbelievably other challenges that are facing us as a species. AIDS was one of the first manifestations of a species-wide threat. We've always had war in our face, and I've never heard anyone juxtapose the anti-war movement of make love, not war, with the fatalities that they used to list in the Vietnam War, with the fatalities that are on the other side of the fulcrum from AIDS, from making love. And so we understand that our life here is a gift, and we also understand as a species we have a propensity to abuse our gifts. So, not that I'm being judgmental, I'm just saying that sex was a vector for that particular plague, driving an automobile, and I paint a lot of cars, but cars are another vector for our disaster.
Sure.
And people say, well, why do you paint cars? Why do you paint cars? And every now and then somebody smart comes along and says, you know, your painting of cars are pretty political. Because there's no people in it. It's such an ideal, such an artificial environment, this car hulking, that's justifying foliage, justifying architecture, and it's this automobile which is completely toxic. And I know it, and I try and put either colors on it without being editorial about it, because at the same time, and not even being ironical, because at the same time, that which put the car in the place was erotic to me. It was attractive. And so I haven't betrayed my love of it. You see? So,
I'm going to get back to the question.
Did I stray?
Well, yeah, you start talking about yourself, Steve.
oh, I promised I wouldn't.
You promised you weren't going to talk about yourself. But you can talk about yourself later.
But I think the car is a vector. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I was going to, because you asked a question that I was like, well, I mean, so there's a couple of, I want to dice this a little bit if I can. I mentioned before that there's the generation of artists who were already sort of mature as artists, and then bam, AIDS came along. There's another generation who grew into AIDS, you know, who were students or just emerging, and then they sort of encountered this world in which AIDS was happening. So their entire artistic growth was connected to the epidemic. But having said that, I think it's important to also point out that artists are still dying of AIDS all the time. And artists of that original generation are still dying.
Right.
I mean, I thought of Frank Moore recently.
Exactly.
Tony Fair, who died 2 years ago. You know, there may have been complicating factors in both those, deaths. But nonetheless, it's not as if it's over. It's not as if that story is finished.
Well, there's an organization called Visual AIDS where they're representing artists living with HIV and helping.
And so you mentioned General Idea. I mean, A.A. Bronson is very active. He's part of the original generation. Yeah. Hunter Reynolds would be another artist showing in New York, who's really his entire artistic trajectory has been about coping with HIV and AIDS since his emergence as a young man.
Exactly.
And so it's very rare when you have someone who's been making art about their own experience with AIDS for 20, 25 years. But the reason for that is because the mortality arc was so drastic. in the first 10 years.
Exactly.
That people only had 2 or 3 years, if that,
Right.
from diagnosis to death. And then it became longer, and then it became longer, and now you can, in theory, live a quote-unquote normal biological lifespan. But we know that people are continuing to die now who are in their 50s and 60s, who might have lived a much longer life had they not.
Right.
But the urgency of the original
Of that
tenure
generation.
of that generation. And David mentions it in his writings that the medications were making his mind go faster.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we react, we're very sensitive. We might not be able to articulate what it is we're feeling or reacting to. And I think that what I was trying to say about the epidemic, that it was at the forefront of our, well, it was a manifestation of what we were reacting to even before it became articulate. Okay, even before it was AIDS, we were reacting to it. That's what I feel. I feel maybe the punk movement and slashing and torn clothing, and that was not just a rejection of capitalism, but it was a reflection of the system being so toxic that it wasn't going to be survivable by certain vulnerable individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And then AIDS came along and confirmed that, you know? And I think that AIDS is on a continuum, and that there are more things coming. And I think that we're going to be dealing with, AIDS was an imposed death. And I think that our separation from certain realities is going to lead to a massive amount of suicide. I think that our species is going to start killing itself very soon and in great numbers.
Well, that's happening today with
Yes.
PTSD for all the military
PTSD,
people coming
17,
in.
25 soldiers a day, killing
Exactly.
themselves.
Exactly.
And those soldiers are people who have been exposed to a reality that we here in America, suburbia, are so separate from. Oh, we see it on our TV sets for a little while, and then let's click on and watch NCIS or whatever else is on, I don't know. And so we don't live it. We don't know what it's like. Those people who have touched it for a minute, they want to kill themselves later on because there's no place for them to go. And if that reality is coming to us in any form, whether it's as a result of an emergency, fires in California, or a toxicity, the water in, we still have the instruments at hand to ameliorate the effects of these things. But should that ability break down in any way, I'm just seeing it. That's all. I'm sensing it.
I think the presidency of Ronald Reagan was what, 80 to 88?
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
and so that in itself was a period of real depression and crisis
Mm-hmm.
In America. So in that sense, I agree with you. We were already, 3 years into the Reagan presidency
Right.
when AIDS really erupted, and the indifference, worse than indifference, that was shown,
Mm-hmm.
the kind of complete inability to even say AIDS, much less deal with it as an epidemic, that was part and parcel of what he was, what his presidency was about,
Mm-hmm.
which was indifference to human suffering.
And denial.
Right,
He was
so-
the denial president.
Yeah, so the Iran-Contra thing was going on at the same time.
Exactly.
So it was this sort of period when we learned to deeply distrust the government, the administration. And of course, the administration acted as we thought it would, which is
Denial.
with indifference and denial, and even obstructionist attitudes. This is why ACT UP happened.
And where
which
did
was that
Ronald
ACT UP
come
needed
from?
ACT UP needed to come into existence because there were not FDA approvals happening on experimental drug treatments for AIDS, which is why David remarked on the drugs that he was taking, because he was taking AZT, he was taking the first generation, and that stuff was toxic. This
Very
is
toxic.
years before the cocktail was invented, and the generation that took those drugs had unbelievably difficult side effects, because of those drugs. So ACT UP happened because they had to ask the government, like, let's cut through some of this red tape. If these are experimental treatments, let's use them. I mean, people forget that the urgency of that situation at the time, it was a time-based thing.
Right.
Like the difference between a 6-month window and an 18-month window for approving a drug for experimental treatment meant the deaths of thousands of people, including your friends and probably
good God.
lovers.
Yeah.
So it was overwhelming, but
Right.
I think we were already experiencing a crisis. It's as if a crisis broke out right now. To
Exactly.
go back to you, we would almost expect it because of the way this country
Right.
is being run right now.
And
not run.
In the AIDS epidemic, more and more people are getting infected. The younger generation, who has no history with what happened in the late 70s and early 80s, and now there, as a provider of mental health to the arts community, we're seeing more and more artists who have lived through that period, who have lived with the virus for 25, 27 years, and are not vocal about what happened then. They're just focusing on their artwork or the world that they're in today. They're basically just shutting that story, which should be out there for the new generation, the 24-year-old kid who's getting infected because he doesn't know that people were dying left and right in the early part of this epidemic. How do we?
Oh, I see.
How do we sustain that energy, that rage that David had and give that voice in today's generation? Because there are 18, 19-year-old kids who are getting infected with HIV.
Well, if the message that's going out is that HIV/AIDS can be managed, and I do believe that this is, whether intentional or not,
that's what's out there.
then the incentive to avoid contact with the virus isn't there anymore. It's sort of like, well, it just seems to be a different rationale.
Right.
And again, because the sense of urgency has passed. The crisis hasn't really gone away, but the sense of urgency has abated. So the overall kind of cultural feeling about AIDS isn't what it was.
No.
Even remotely what it was 30 years
And
ago.
what paved the way for that was the elimination of STDs for a period of time with antibiotics in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Up until then, syphilis was a huge scourge.
Sure.
And gonorrhea, and you think of, Lenny Bruce did a bit where somebody breaks up with their wife, and so they spread rumors, and he said, so you're going to have dinner with my wife, and the guy says to the guy's wife, well, I'm not going to have dinner with you after what your husband has told me. It's paper cups. I wouldn't share a glass with you. You might have syphilis like that. So the scourge used to be around, and then it abated. And when you were talking about Reagan being the president of denial, that is so true. And if you take it back 2 years, when Jimmy Carter was the president of Malaise, and his message was, we have to pay attention to this feeling of anxiety that's underlying America. And Reagan came in with the Hollywood haircut and said, you don't have to pay attention to that. And they drummed Jimmy Carter out like that with this smiley face.
What did he say? The worst 11 words that you can hear in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That was Reagan's slogan.
There you go.
Those are words we should be very afraid of.
Right.
From the government.
Let me just open the conversation to the audience. Any questions to both David and Stephen? Any thoughts about what you heard from both of these gentlemen?
Well, I'm really thinking about the scene in terms of that. I think we thought of ourselves as being prophetic. That profession, and that really seems to be unique in the East Village scene. I think a lot of artists we felt that we did have something to say to the society, even though, yeah, people have their egos, their careers and all that, but there was this underlying urgency that I think, Stephen's really touching on. And that's what made it unique, particularly to my perception. We thought there was trouble. We thought that the world was in a very serious condition, and that's like already 30 years ago. So now it really, it's almost fulfilling, this prophecy is being fulfilled. And, that's what moves me about that period.
I don't know if anyone else
or not, or that those kind of things are less important in some ways.
Well, I don't know if anyone else saw this, but the Alden Gallery in Lower East Side had a show of Richard McGuire recently. Richard was, had the band Liquid Liquid, and he had the Ixnay Nix was his character, and he did a lot of street art, during the late 70s and the early 80s, and then it just completely vanished from the scene. There was there was never an effort at the time for any gallery to show him. Occasionally he would be written up in the East Village Eye, but the idea that Richard was an artist was just quickly swept away and buried. And so this show that Alden had was absolutely shocking, because in a way it's a time capsule. It's like a moment from your life 35 years ago, but it's kind of at the peripheral edge of your awareness. Like, it wasn't what you were looking at, but it was sort of more in the frame of what you were looking at. And suddenly it's made front and center the exact same work from 35 years ago, looking perfect. It's absolutely pristine. It's been kept. And I had that feeling, which I often have, which is that, this was our lifetime and the story still isn't being told. The story is still incomplete. This history is being unpacked and it's unfolding right before our eyes. And we're talking about 35 years ago already. And so much of it is still a mystery. I don't know if that was to your point.
Yeah, no,
it seemed like it was.
Any other thoughts? Yeah. Hal?
You may remember Reagan saying, "It's morning in America."
Sure.
That your remarks about Reagan with the smiley face, that was very much a part of it. But if you think about today, make America great again, isn't it in a way inviting people to try to get back to that happy face, it's morning in America? And of course what Reagan was trying to do, according to some political pundits, was to help people go back to the end of World War II. The soldiers, the troops all came home, Europe was on the mend, bombed out cities were being rebuilt, everybody could buy a house in the suburbs, get a new car, everything was hopeful. So that was, according to some, what Reagan was pushing. But I'm just wondering if you think, in terms of political situations, if you think that that's maybe what Trump's camp has been pushing.
Oh,
Kind of inviting them.
most definitely.
The kind
And
of green world,
but it's a very incomplete vision. Actually, the vision is complete, but the departure point is incomplete, because those boys that came home from World War II, and I hate to say, oh God, I've been around for a long time, Hal, and I knew some beats, and they told me, said, you kids don't understand that everything that you're looking at, all this rock and roll and Mick Jagger, comes from the jazz era. And after World War II, the beats, that wasn't like bongo drums on a tabletop. We were beat. And when you say, Hal, that these guys came home and they were going to buy a house in suburbia, there was a whole disenfranchised generation that couldn't face that shit. They couldn't face the cookie-cutter Levittown reality that was being defined for them, and they migrated downtown, and that's where Allen Ginsberg came out with Howl, and that's now the mantra of one of the great galleries on the Lower East Side, and it's a movement, and it's continuing, and it comes from all of that, and you know, there was rage there, but the society was so tight, and the man in the gray flannel suit was so strong, and that cookie cutter reality, with only a little bit of peeking under the crinolines of Peyton Place. So you couldn't rage against it on the street. But Alan and the gang, Neil Cassidy and all of that, and I don't want to talk about myself, but I knew Neil for a second or two. And there was a big flash in my freaking acid brain. And anyway, you know, they laid the seeds down. And David grabbed the ball and he ran with it. And David and, I mean, Louis was like an older statesman in a lot of ways. And he calmed David down. And one time I was talking to Louis, and I know I've told this story a few times, I can't get over it. He was in awe of David and horrified at the same time. And he goes, he's eating 7 meals a day. Who can feed him? Who can keep up with this? You know, he was horrified, Louis, you know. But David was like metabolizing at 100 miles an hour, whether it was the virus or pre-virus or the anticipation or the beat that was taking him to the virus. It's where we were. But another thing that happened after the war, and I think it was manifest on the Ed Sullivan Show of all things. Around 1956, they played a cartoon of a human face turning into a skull after an atomic blast. Does anyone here remember that? And Ed Sullivan was up there and saying, take the kids out of the room, they shouldn't see this. But he put it on this thing. What I'm trying to underline is after the Second World War and the atomic bomb, it became evident that we, mankind, can fuck this planet sideways. We can rip it a leaky asshole that will never heal. Okay? It'll be running blood in all the rivers. It's going to make the Bible look like a local journal, you know? And that's the capacity of the atomic age. And we've subdued that. And when you say, make America great again, that cocksucker is trying to boost the industry that builds the weaponry, that challenges, so him and Putin can play the game and skim a little bit off of the top of the manufacturing of those weapons. And that's what they're trying to bring out and put down. And that's some of the issues that people are raging against, like ACT UP. I mean, when you see the Pussy Riot girls and when you see the Pussy Hats going on Washington, I mean, that is great stuff. And that came out of ACT UP. So when you talk about the AIDS situation and where it's going and who has AIDS today and what are they painting like, yeah, that's cool and that's valid. But also, let's talk about the fucking legacy. Let's talk about what happened at Stonewall. Was it Stonewall? The gay bar that had that situation. Stonewall. What did I say?
You said Stonewall.
Oh,
Yeah,
I did.
you did.
Oh, God, I'm really losing it. Nurse.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Any thoughts? Any additions?
Can I answer what Hal said?
Sure,
I think
absolutely.
there's an interesting tie-in between Reagan and the current occupant of the White House, which is that both come initially from the realm of illusion, where you know, one was an actor in movies and the other had a reality show. And I think in both cases, what we're talking about is, you know, someone whose first talent is to be able to look into a camera and lie.
Yeah.
And to create a kind of a seamless illusion of a reality, which, if you have any critical capacity for inquiry and intelligence, you won't fall for. But if you are vulnerable to that kind of salesmanship, to that kind of an illusion, you can fall victim to it. You can fall prey. And I think we all know cases in which, as they said, they're lost now. We've sort of lost a whole part of our society because they're under the spell of this particular illusion. I think the real difference between Reagan's age and this age is that Reagan actually did successfully create an idea of benevolence, a sort of a happy,
Right.
a happy skin.
Hollywood.
And underneath that happy skin, there was a lot of pus. There was a lot of horrible stuff churning around. A lot of violence. A lot of
A lot of violence, a lot of intimidation.
Today we don't have that gloss of happiness anymore.
No, it's right out there.
MAGA is about anger and grievance and sort of continuing to rouse the worst sentiments of a portion of the population. So whatever happiness Reagan was trying to sell, and we could talk about whether he was an effective salesman or not, that whole idea of the happy society. What did you call it? America, the New Dawn. That's over. We don't do that anymore in this country. We don't make happiness as an ideology. What we sell is grievance and resentment.
Kincaid is dead?
And
Is
that's
that what you're saying?
Kincaid, wasn't he Canadian?
I hope not.
Yes.
It just sounds Canadian.
Yes, I have mixed feelings in sharing with you the news that Thomas Kincaid is no longer with us.
Oh, Gavalt.
Oh, okay.
That was my sense of what you were saying about Alex.
Well, because that's a great end note,
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Well, that too.
Come on, we can do
But
that.
I love the fact that you talk about Reagan and Trump and their presence to the camera. And of course, one is offering comfort and the other one is saying, join me, we're going to beat up the other team. Although Ronnie was kind of alluding to that. And that that was the line I loved, that they could look at the camera and lie. Mm-hmm. But parallel to that were your James Dean and your Marlon Brando and your guys that were trying to look at the camera and not lie. And that was that. So one of the great things about America is that it does always or seem to have an alternative reality that can be that can go mainstream.
Said by a good Canadian.
From punk culture to main culture.
Yeah,
To mass
you know.
culture.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for showing up on this cold night. And we have 2 more to go.
We'll be back with Dan Cameron after this.
After the break.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen.